There are whispers that ride the northern windlow and guttural things, carried from the edge of icebound fjords and bleeding forests, where the sun dared only skim the horizon. Among these tales, buried deep in the marrow of time, lies one particular account. Fawa, yes, but strangely enthralling. It is the story of the Rayar. The blood rite of the Viking raiders, not a fable, nor a warrior's boast, but a practice as obscene as it was sacred. Some call it madness, others, devotion. But all who remember speak in shudders and silence. It began with the turning of seasons, when frost shattered the rivers and the wolves' howls grew closer to the halls of men. This was the time of the outcasty young men stripped of inheritance, banished for blood debts, or born under cursed stars. These were the chosen, not by kings, but by shadows. Each spring, they gathered in the forest of Nip, where the roots twisted like throttled serpents and the trees wept a sap as black as pitch. There, under a stone effigy worn smooth by centuries of offerings, they were welcomed by the matriarchs of the ash. They were not queens. These women, they were older than thrones, older than runes, barefoot and blind. They moved with the certainty of memory, their hair knotted with bones of children who had never taken breath. One was said to be nearly 300 years old and smelled of cedar and rot. They feared them more than Odin, more than the sea. And yet, they obeyed. The rite began not with blood, but with the silence of breath held too long. One by one, the young men were stripped bare, smeared with the fat of a stillborn lamb, and made to kneel before a basin of silver filled with fermented mares, milk and ash. The matriarchs would chant never in words, but in tones, elongated wails that mimicked the cries of women in labor. This was not performance, it was memory. It was the remembering. Each man was given a partner, not a shield maiden, but an spirit wife, as the matriarchs called them. They were women taken during raids, never seen again by their kin, whose tongues had long been cut, whose names had been erased, silent, shivering, and adorned in veils, soaked in hemlock. These spirit wives were not chosen for their beauty, but their brokenness. They were instructed not to speak to them, not to touch without command, and never, under pain of slow flaying, to ask them where they came from. To do so would stir the dead. The first night of the rite was called the twilight binding. It was then the young warriors lay beside their spirit wives, backs turned, without sleep, without touch. For 7 hours, they listened to the woods scream. The matriarchs walked among them, dragging chains behind them, whispering stories into ears. Not all the stories were in the same tongue. Some were in words, older than fire, others in the language of insects or moaning winds. Yet all told the same tale, that the seed of man was a blade, and the womb of woman a scabbard, and that when they joined, gods bled. By the second night came the testing. The men were led one by one into the cave beneath the stone, a place so old it was said even Thor had wept upon seeing it. Inside was the altar of hewn, soaked in generations of sacrifice, stinking of copper and salt. Upon it lay a woman, never the same, always breathing, never moving. Her limbs were bound in thorn rope, her mouth stitched in silence. Each was given a flint blade no longer than a finger and a cup of pine smoke to inhale. What followed, only they knew. Some returned with eyes wide and smiles too large. Others screamed until their tongues bled. One, it is told, walked into the sea the next dawn and was never seen again. But this was not cruelty for sport. The matriarchs claimed it was pure, that through perversion, one might touch divinity, as filth magnifies light. The darkest shadow comes from the brightest flame. That was their mantra. That, and all blood sings. On the third night, the final night, the Talagi and their spirit wives were taken to the grove of Amp. There, beneath the canopy of carcasses wolves, Dear Mende, consummated the rite. Not with lust, not with joy, but with terror, for they were told their ancestors were watching, and judging, and feeding. Here, the most disturbing aspect emerges, for it was said that at the moment of climax, the spirit wife would whisper, just once, the name of the man she had once loved, a name stolen from her memory, like a ghost from a corpse. And in that moment, the Tlagi would know he was not himself, but a Vesselan echo of another, and the matriarchs would cry out, the wheel turns. What did this rite achieve? What horror did it hope to contain or unleash? None now can say, the practice died as the forest did, burned by monks or swallowed by ice. But some say descendants of the Talagi still bear the mark, that in their blood sleeps an ancient sickness, one that tastes of ash and desire, one that cannot be named without waking it. And so the wind still whispers. In guttural moans and sobbing laughter, it whispers of the blood, right? Of the matriarchs of the ash, and of the nameless men who became more and less than human beneath their hands. There was once a coastal village in what is now southern Norway, long swallowed by waves and memory. The locals called it Vargheim, the home of wolves, not because of the beasts that prowled the edges of its forests, but for the men it bred. Every third year, when the rite drew near, emissaries from the matriarchs arrived barefoot in the snow, cloaked in crow feathers, to select their candidates. They never asked. They simply pointed, and once chosen, none returned whole. It was here that a boy named Eirik Halvorsen was taken, born to a fisherman who beat him with rope ends and a mother who prayed to Christian saints in secret. He had grown silent and strange. Other boys told stories of him sitting alone in the marshes, muttering to the reeds, or tracing spiral runes in the dirt with bone. But the elders paid no heed till the matriarchs came, and their blind eyes turned toward him, as if they could see through flesh into the soul beneath. He did not resist. When they led him away, his only words were, "I have already dreamed this." His mother wailed, clutching a charm of Mary between her teeth. His father watched without blinking, as if relief had finally come. The journey to Nippeheller took 7 days and 7 nights. Eirik walked barefoot. Despite the frost and bled a trail, the matriarchs never acknowledged. They spoke not a word to him, but when he collapsed on the 6th day, one of them knelt beside him and whispered something into his open mouth, something that made the birds fall silent and the trees creak like gallows. When they arrived at the stone effigy, the other Tulagi had already begun their first night of silence. Eirik was given no preparation, no instruction. The matriarch said simply, "He remembers," and turned away. His spirit wife was unlike the others. While they cowered and avoided gaze, his stood tall, veil unsoiled, fingers tipped with silver paint. She bore no tremble, only a stillness so complete, it seemed sculpted. The others murmured that she was not, but something older, something unbound. They called her Scotty's mirror reflection of the goddess of vengeance and winter, said to walk among the cursed when her name is forgotten by men. That first night, she did not lie beside Eirik, but stood at the foot of his cot, unmoving eyes beneath her veil fixed upon him. He could not sleep, he could barely breathe. It was as though her gaze reached into the chambers of his mind and tapped upon doors he had never dared open. By the second night, Ra, the testing, came. The matriarchs led him down into the cave with the others. But unlike the rest, Eirik was not offered pine smoke. He refused the blade. Instead, he walked to the altar and whispered something into the ear of the bound woman, something that made her cry without sound. And then, with his bare hands, he traced a spiral over her chest in ash. The matriarchs gasped, for the spiral was an old sign, banned even among them. It was called the Jinnengringer, the primeval Wuma, symbol of creation, yes, but also of chaos. It had not been drawn in 3 generations, not since the last man who tried had set himself aflame and laughed as his eyes melted. That night, Eirik did not return with wide eyes or bleeding mouth. He walked calmly, hands blackened, a smile twitching at the edge of his lips. When the matriarchs asked what he had seen, he said only, "The gate is open." The final night was colder than any in memory. Ice crusted the antlers above, and the trees groaned like dying whales. They gathered with their spirit wives, some weeping, some numb. Eirik stood in the center, his companion beside him, neither touching nor speaking. The matriarchs began the chant, but it faltered. Their voices, for the first time, trembled. Something was wrong. The air thickened. The shadows bent at wrong angles, and then she moved. Eirik's spirit wife stepped forward, not toward him, but toward the matriarch. They fell to their knees as one, clutching their faces. The veil dropped, and beneath it was not a face, but a mask of silver bone, shifting as if alive, weeping a black eye cord that steamed upon hitting the frozen ground. Her voice, when it came, was not human. It was wind and thunder, and something like a mother singing to a child she had buried too early. "I am not your vessel," she said. "I am not your echo." Eirik stood silent. Then, with ritual precision, he cut his palm and pressed it to her chest. Where the blood touched her skin, runes bloomed, runic shapes no one had seen before, as if language itself had fractured to birth them. The matriarch screamed. One burst into flame. Another tore out her own tongue. And the third crawled into the earth, vanishing into a crack that had not been there moments before. Eirik turned to the others and said, "You have swallowed filth and called it sacrament, but I have tasted the truth. She is not death. She is the womb of war." No one slept that night. Some fled the grove, never speaking again. Others remained in a trance, their eyes glassy, chanting the runes they could not understand. As for Eirik and the spirit wife Scotty's mirror, they vanished at dawn, leaving behind only a trail of frozen petals and bones etched with spirals. To this day, in ruins swallowed by moss and fog, some say you can still hear her voice. Not loud, not cruel, but inevitable, calling not to men, but to what lies buried within them. And those who answer, ... are never quite the same. In the years that followed, Eirik's vanishing, the rite fractured. The matriarchs once revered, once feared were no longer seen. The stone effigy at Nippeheller collapsed in a storm no records acknowledge. Its eyes split clean by lightning. The ash trees around the ritual grounds wept sap so foul it corroded the bones of deer that passed too close. And in the villages of the north, children began to be born with strange marked spirals upon their chests. Tongues that murmured in sleep, a language no living mouth had taught. These were called the Hollow Sons. Not truly sons, not truly Hala, but cursed vessels offspring of men who had taken the right and survived. Their mothers once raided, now bound or fused. To speak of the nights, their wombs quickened. They stared instead into nothingness, like those who had seen stars fall too close. And the children, as they grew, showed signs. They did not cry at birth, they did not fear fire, and at 7 winters, each one carved a spiralois with bone, never taught into the skin of their own palms. Some said they were touched by Skadi's mirror herself. Others believed them to be seeds planted by Urik's blood. One such child was Leif Torsen, born in a village, lost now to fjords and silence. His mother, a former thrall with hair white before her time, refused to name the father. At 3, Leif disassembled his father's boat and rebuilt it on land upside down but perfect in every joint. At 5, he wept beside a frozen stag, whispering to it as if it could still hear. And at 10 he began to dream of a place he had never seen, a grove of antlers and singing trees. On the morning of his 12th winter, Leif disappeared. The villagers searched the shoreline, the forests, the ice fields, but found no tracks. Only a spiral carved into the front door of his home, deeper than any knife could cut, and a single sentence painted in animal blood. I go where fathers go. That spring, rumors spread. Traders returning from the north claimed they had seen a child walking across the frozen fjord barefoot, followed by a procession of wolves. He spoke in tongues, they said, and where he walked, the snow turned black. It was then that the church intervened. By this point, Christianity had crept deep into the Norse lands, like oil and water, slow, persistent, and suffocating. The bishops had tolerated the old stories as superstition, harmless echoes of pagan dust, but the hollow sons frightened even them. They dispatched inquisitors dressed not in white, but in Ashgar men, whose hands bore more scars than rings, and whose faith was sharpened by fire. It was then that the church intervened. By this point, Christianity had crept deep into the Norse lands like oil and water, slow, persistent, and suffocating. The bishops had tolerated the old stories as superstition, harmless echoes of pagan dust, but the hollow sons frightened even them. They dispatched inquisitors dressed not in white, but in Ashgar men, whose hands bore more scars than rings, and whose faith was sharpened by fire. Their leader was Bishop Arnulf of Trier, a man said to have read every forbidden gospel and burned the rest. He was gaunt, his voice brittle as parchment, and he spoke only when necessary, never in anger, but always in certainty. When he arrived in Vargame, he did not knock. He entered the longhouses and placed crosses of blackened iron upon the hearths, then commanded silence. He declared the hollow sons to be blasphemies of the flesh, echoes of a forbidden joining between spirit and man. He spoke of a womb of frost, beneath the roots of the earth, from which the matriarchs had drawn their power, not from gods, but from something older and crueler, something that drank the grief of women and sang lullabies and screams. Under his order, the forests were purged. Ash trees were felled and burned. With salt, midwives were drowned. Those barren spirals on their skin were dragged before fires and made to confess to crimes they did not understand. Some claimed to dream of Eirik. Some remembered nothing. One child, just 9 years old, stood atop the pyre and whispered, "We will not burn. We will bloom." And when the flames touched him, he did not scream. He laughed. It was then Bishop Arnulf ordered the excavation of Nipaheller to cleanse it once and for all. It took 30 men and 5 days to break through the roots and stone. When they reached the cave, they found the altar, intact though the rock bled like meat. Upon it sat a single rune, scrawled in human teeth, the Jinn, and beside it lay a girl, no older than 12, eyes wide open, breathing and smiling. They sealed the cave. Arnulf wrote no report. He left that night, alone, and was never seen again. Some say he wandered into the ice. Others claim he clawed out his own eyes before walking into the but his journal was found years later, sealed in wax, buried beneath the chapel floor. The final entry read, "They are not born, they are remembered." Now, centuries later, there are those who still bear the spirals, not in the north, but scattered hidden among orphanages, monasteries, hospitals. Some deny their meaning. Others, when pressed, say they have seen Hertha, silver-masked woman with hands of ash and a voice like the wind inside a womb. And some God helped them go, seeking the cave beneath the forest, the altar, the rite. But Nipaheller is gone, or so we like to believe. Centuries passed. The forests thinned, the gods changed names. But the spiral remained. In the vaults beneath the old universities in Prague, in dust-covered men, bear warnings etched in pigskin and stitched with human hair. Beware the sons who do not cry. Most scholars dismiss these as folktales, crude allegories for grief or war trauma. But some those who study not history, but its shadow see the pattern, villages whose children vanish on the equinox. Ruins where no birds sing. Names repeated in tongues no longer spoken. Erik Skadi, Ginong. It was in 1937 that the spiral surfaced again, not in frost, but in fire. A psychiatric hospital outside Uppsala reported a patient, mute, unnamed, who carved a perfect spiral into the stone walls of his cell with his fingernail. The doctor, a rational man of modern medicine, chalked it up to hysteria. But one nurse, raised on the edge of pine-shadowed lakes, recognized it. She left that night, barefoot, and was found 2 weeks later hanging from an ash tree. Her stomach swollen, though she'd never lain with man. Inside her belly was a smooth stone carved with the word, return. That same year, German archaeologists, scouring the north for Aryan roots, discovered a buried chamber in the Devrafil Mountains. No door, no stairs, just a spiral carved into the rock, so deep it hummed. Inside, they found bones not just human, but something else. Elongated jaws, ribs fused like petals, a mirror of polished obsidian taller than a man, and a single preserved fetus, still wet after millennia, its eyes open. The site was sealed, the records lost in the war. But some say Himmler kept a fragment of that mirror in his private study, and that he forbade women to enter the room after dusk. After the war, things quieted. Science, television, speed these things, chased the old ghosts back into the soil, or so we told ourselves. But the rite was never a ritual. It was a seed. And seeds wait. In 1999, a documentary crew filming the aurora in northern Sweden caught strange footage never aired, but archived. At 3:17 a.m., the camera tilted to the woods behind them and captured a procession of children, barefoot, walking in perfect silence across snow, spirals etched into their backs. Behind them, a woman face obscured by ice and silver light whispered something. The audio spiked. The cameraman died a week later of sudden bleeding in the lungs. No autopsy could explain why his heart had calcified into stone. Today, you will find no mention of Nippeheller on any map, but if you speak the name aloud in a certain dialect, one no longer LL feel. The air change, cold, wet, as though breath is drawn from your lungs by something listening. There are those, scattered in forests and cities alike, who say the right calls again, that the world, having forgotten pain, must that men have built too high and must be dragged back down to the root, to the womb, to the blood. They speak of Scotty's mirror, walking once more in veils of frost and bone, of children who are not born, but remembered, of spiral marks blooming like flowers across the chests of orphans and war survivors, of voices heard inside pregnancy wards, of ash trees appearing overnight in courtyards, bleeding sap the color of rust. And they whisper of a boy perhaps named Leaf, or something older still seen, walking the edge of frozen lakes, whispering to the wind. Behind him, footprints that do not melt. In his hand, a small, jagged knife, not made of steel, but of polished bone. He is not coming. He has already come. Because the rite is not dead. It was never meant to die. It was waiting for you to listen. And now that you will never stop hearing her voice.